When my husband died, he left me a locked drawer I wasn't supposed to open until our anniversary. What I found inside didn't feel like a gift. Good morning, dear listeners. I'm so glad you're here with me today. I'm Clara, and this is where I come to share the stories that don't fit anywhere else. The ones too complicated for a phone call, too heavy for a dinner conversation. If you're new here, please subscribe and leave me a comment telling me where you're listening from. It genuinely moves me every single time. Martin Holt died on a Friday in November, cardiac arrest. He was 54 years old and had run a half marathon the previous spring. That's the detail I kept returning to in the weeks after. The half marathon, the training schedule he'd kept on the refrigerator. The new running shoes still by the back door with barely 100 miles on them. A man who trained for a half marathon at 54 does not seem like a man who is about to die. And yet, we had been married for 19 years. We met in Raleigh when I was 29 and he was 32. And we had built the kind of life that looks, from the outside, like the goal. A house in Cary, North Carolina, with a yard I loved and a kitchen we'd renovated twice. A daughter, Becca, who was 17 when her father died and who handled it the way she handled everything, by going very quiet and very focused, as if grief were a problem she could solve with enough concentration. Martin had worked in commercial insurance, a regional director for a national firm, traveling to Charlotte and Atlanta, and occasionally further for client meetings. Steady work, the kind that doesn't make headlines but pays consistently and builds slowly towards something. I was a physical therapist. I'd gone part-time when Becca started high school, which Martin had encouraged in a way I'd appreciated at the time. More flexibility, he said. You've been burning the candle at both ends for years. I had not questioned it. That was true of a great many things. The night he died, I was at a friend's book club 3 miles away. My phone buzzed with a call from a number I didn't recognize, and something in me, some animal instinct I cannot fully explain, made me step out of the living room to answer it. The paramedic on the other end was careful and professional and told me what had happened in the plainest words possible, which was a mercy I understood only later. The weeks that followed are not something I can describe linearly. Grief isn't linear. It's more like weather. Sometimes a drizzle you barely notice. Sometimes a storm that pins you inside yourself for days isn't. Becca and I moved through the house like we were orbiting each other, close but not quite touching. My sister, Anne, flew in from Denver for 10 days and took care of things I couldn't locate the energy to care about. Flowers, casseroles, thank you notes. She asked me once if I was eating, and I said yes, and we both understood I was approximating. Martin had always managed our finances. I want to say that plainly because I know how it sounds, and I know that women my age are supposed to know better. I was an educated woman with a graduate degree and a career. I understood copays and insurance claims and mortgage amortization schedules in the abstract. But Martin had taken it on early in our marriage, with a competence and a confidence that I had allowed to become a wall between me and any real understanding of our financial life. He paid the bills. He managed the investment accounts. He handled the taxes with an accountant named Dale Bryson, who had been their accountant before I entered the picture and who had always sent documents to Martin's email. I signed what I was handed and did not ask enough questions. I tell you this not as an excuse, but because it's true, and because truth is the only thing I have left to offer. Martin had a home office in the converted spare bedroom upstairs. Bookshelves, a desk he'd built himself from plans he'd found online, a filing cabinet he kept locked. I had always found the locked filing cabinet vaguely funny. Martin, the insurance man, protecting his documents. After he died, I found the key on his keyring, sandwiched between the car key and the house key, and I felt no urgency to open it. I was still in the phase of grief where the objects belonging to a dead person feel sacred, untouchable. It was Becca who found the note. She was looking for his guitar chord book. Martin had played guitar badly and cheerfully for as long as I'd known him, in the bottom drawer of his desk. The note was underneath a folder, in an envelope with my name written on the front in his handwriting. Not sealed, just folded closed. She brought it to me in the kitchen without reading it, and I could tell from the way she held it. Carefully, at a slight distance, as if it were something that needed handling, that she understood it was significant. The note said, "The bottom drawer of the filing cabinet has everything you need. Don't open it until our anniversary. February 14th. I'm sorry, it has to be this way. I love you, Meg. I always did." He called me Meg. He was the only person who ever called me Meg. My name is Margaret, and everyone else has always called me Maggie or Margaret. But Martin said Meg fit me better, and he'd been right in the way he was sometimes right about small things precisely and without needing to explain himself. I sat at the kitchen table and read the note 4 times. February 14th. That was 11 weeks away. He had written this knowing he might not be here, or at least preparing for the possibility. And the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, not a key, not an explanation. An instruction and a date and an apology folded into 11 words. I didn't open the drawer that night. I want to be honest about what the next weeks felt like, because this story isn't just about what I found. It's about what it feels like to live with a question you're not sure you want answered. I went back to work part-time in January, which my colleagues had encouraged and which turned out to be exactly right. Having somewhere to be and something to do with my hands kept me from disappearing into myself entirely. I made Becca dinner. I returned phone calls. I was, by most visible measures, functioning, but I had started noticing things. I am a physical therapist. My entire training is about reading the body, what it reveals about itself when it thinks no one is paying attention. I applied that same attention, eventually, to Martin's financial life, and what I found was a body that wasn't moving the way it should. The first thing was the retirement accounts. Martin had a 401(n) through his employer and a separate IRA we'd opened together early in our marriage. When the estate attorney, a kind and efficient woman named Carol Finch, helped me pull together the account balances, the IRA showed a balance significantly lower than what I had vaguely understood it to be. Not catastrophically lower, just wrong enough to notice. Carol said it happened sometimes. People made withdrawals without telling their spouses, changed contribution levels, borrowed against accounts. She didn't say it to alarm me. She said it the way doctors sometimes describe a concerning reading on a scan, with the practiced calm of someone who has learned to deliver information without projecting outcome. The second thing was a credit card I didn't know existed. It came in the mail in mid-January, addressed to Martin from a bank I didn't recognize. A final statement on an account in his name only, with a balance of a little over $9,000. I looked at the charges. Most of them were unremarkable. Gas stations, a hardware store, a restaurant I recognized. But there were hotel charges, Raleigh hotels, on dates when Martin had told me he was working from home. I set the statement on the kitchen table, and I sat across from it, and I thought very carefully about what I was doing. Once I pulled that thread, I understood I wasn't going to be able to stop pulling. I pulled it. I went to Dale Bryson's office. I introduced myself as Martin's widow, which still sounded wrong in my mouth the way new words do before they settle in, and I asked him to walk me through our financial picture. Dale was a man in his 60s with the practiced warmth of someone who has delivered bad news enough times to have developed a cushion for it. He pulled up the files and he walked me through what he had, and what he had, I quickly understood, was less than what existed. There were accounts he hadn't prepared returns for. Not hidden exactly. Martin had filed them separately through an online service. I found this out later, but not part of the picture Dale had been given to manage. I asked Dale directly whether this struck him as unusual. He said, carefully, that clients sometimes compartmentalize their finances and that it wasn't uncommon for a spouse to manage certain accounts privately. He said it without accusation. I heard it without illusion. February 14th fell on a Wednesday that year, a gray, cold morning with the kind of sky that can't decide between rain and overcast. Becca was at school. I had taken the day off. I unlocked the filing cabinet at 9 in the morning. The bottom drawer held two things: a sealed envelope with my name on it, and a small combination lockbox, the kind you can buy at any hardware store. I opened the envelope first. Martin's letter was 3 pages, handwritten on yellow legal pad paper, the same kind he'd kept on his desk for as long as I'd known him, always with a pen clipped to the top. His handwriting was the careful print of someone who'd been told as a child that his cursive was illegible, and had compensated ever since. I won't reproduce the whole letter here. What I will tell you is what it contained, because you deserve the truth of it. Martin had been having an affair. Not a brief one, a sustained, deliberate relationship with a woman named Cheryl Contos, whom he had met through work 6 years ago and who lived in Durham, 20 miles from our house in Cary. He had, and this is the part that still requires effort to say out loud, been supporting her financially. Not lavishly, but consistently. An apartment he contributed to, a car note he covered, regular transfers from a bank account I had never known existed. He had, he wrote, loved me. He wanted me to believe that. He also wrote that he understood if I didn't. He had been diagnosed with a heart condition 2 years earlier, the same condition that eventually killed him. And the diagnosis had produced in him a reckoning that he had handled, characteristically by making a plan rather than a confession. He had documented everything, the parallel account, the transfers, the full scope of what had been diverted from our shared financial life. He estimated the total at somewhere between $180,000 and $200, 0 over the course of the relationship. The lockbox combination, he wrote, was the year we got married. 2004. Inside the lockbox were bank statements, transfer records, email printouts, and a USB drive, everything he had kept. I sat on the floor of Martin's home office on Valentine's Day, and I read the letter twice and looked at the documents once, and then I put everything back in the lockbox, and I went downstairs and I made myself a cup of coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard. At the oak tree, Martin had strung with lights 2 Christmases ago. At the garden bed, I'd been meaning to expand for 3 years. The ordinary geometry of a life we'd shared. I did not cry. Not then. The crying came later, in the middle of the night, the sudden kind that wakes you up already mid-grief, like your body started without asking your permission. That morning, I was just very still. The question was not whether what he'd done was wrong. That was settled. The question was what I was going to do about it. My first call was to Carol Finch. I told her that the estate's financial picture was more complicated than we'd initially understood, and that I needed guidance on how to properly account for funds that had been transferred out of marital assets over a period of several years. Carol listened with the focused attention of someone who had heard versions of this before, and then she said, very quietly, that I needed a different kind of attorney for this part, and that she knew exactly who to call. She gave me the name of a woman named Sandra Pratt, a family law and estate litigation attorney in Raleigh, who specialized in cases involving financial misconduct and hidden assets. Carol said she was methodical and unsentimental and very good. She said those things in order, and the order felt deliberate. I called Sandra Pratt's office the next morning. The receptionist asked the nature of the matter. I said it was a complex estate issue involving undisclosed assets. I did not say anything about Cheryl Contos. Not yet. Sandra Pratt's office was downtown, third floor of a brick building on Fayetteville Street. The kind of Raleigh office that projects competence without trying to impress. Sandra herself was in her mid-50s, with the manner of someone who had stopped performing warmth and found it had made her more effective, not less. She listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, she asked 3 questions. How long ago were the transfers initiated? Were there records, and did I have access to the USB drive? Yes, I said, to all 3. She told me what she could do. Under North Carolina law, assets transferred out of a marital estate without spousal knowledge or consent during a marriage are potentially recoverable, depending on circumstances. With documentation, the picture was clearer than in most cases she saw. She said that Martin, in a way that was probably not entirely deliberate, had made this easier than it might have been by keeping records. He was an insurance man. He couldn't stop documenting things, even when the thing he was documenting was his own wrongdoing. There were complications. The money had gone to support a living person, not a business or an account in a vault. Some of it was likely unrecoverable in any practical sense. But the accounts themselves, the funds still, the accumulated undisclosed assets, those were a different matter. She filed an initial notice with the estate court on a Thursday in late February. By Friday afternoon, I had a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. A man's voice, polite, introducing himself as an attorney representing Cheryl Contos. His name was Brian Culver. He said he understood there had been some legal activity related to Martin Holt's estate and that his client wanted to resolve matters amicably. He said amicably the way people say it when they mean quickly, before things get complicated for them. I told him that all communication needed to go through Sandra Pratt. He said of course, and the call ended in under 2 minutes. I called Sandra and gave her the account. She said predictably, "Good. They know we're moving. I want to tell you about the particular texture of that period because I think it's important. People imagine that a situation like this produces constant high drama, confrontations, sleepless nights, the sense of being in the middle of something cinematic. The reality was quieter and stranger than that. I went to work 3 days a week. I made Becca dinner. I drove her to school and picked her up and watched her move through her senior year with the focus she'd inherited from her father and the stubbornness she'd gotten from me. I had told her, carefully, that her father's estate was complicated and that I was working through it with an attorney. I had not told her about Cheryl, not yet. That was a conversation I was not ready to have, and I needed to know more before I brought Becca into the full weight of it. The woman who helped me understand that full weight was named Donna Albrecht. Donna had worked as Martin's executive assistant for 3 years before leaving the company 18 months before he died. I'd met her once at a company holiday party, remembered her as quiet and observant in the way of someone who notices more than they say. I found her through LinkedIn, identified myself carefully in a message as Martin's widow, and said I was trying to understand some aspects of his work history, and wondered if she'd be willing to speak with me. She agreed almost immediately. We met at a coffee shop in North Raleigh on a Saturday morning in early March. Donna was in her 40s, unhurried, with the measured quality of someone who had been deciding for a long time whether or not to say something and had finally decided. She told me that Martin had, in the last 2 years of her employment, been increasingly distracted and occasionally absent in ways that didn't match his stated schedule. She had covered for him twice with his supervisor, small things, scheduling conflicts, nothing she'd flagged at the time because she'd believed his explanations. But she had also, she said, handled travel bookings, and there had been stays at Durham hotels on dates when Martin's calendar showed him in the Cary office. She hadn't asked. It wasn't her place. But she had kept her own. She was, she said with a small, dry smile, a very organized person. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of travel receipts, calendar entries, and 3 email chains between Martin and an address she didn't recognize, printed during a period when she'd had access to his work inbox on a shared project. She had printed them because something had felt wrong, and she had held on to them because she hadn't known what else to do. Her eyes were level when she said this, and I believed her completely. The emails confirmed the timeline Martin himself had described in his letter and extended it by 8 months. He and Cheryl Contos had been communicating since she'd been with the company as a vendor contact, which meant the relationship was older than Martin had written, by a significant margin. I drove home from that coffee shop the way I'd been driving everywhere since November, both hands on the wheel, deliberate speed, the particular focus of someone who understands they cannot afford to be in an accident right now. I called Sandra that evening and told her about Donna and the folder. There was a brief pause. Then Sandra said, "Bring it Monday first thing." I did. The legal process that followed was not fast. I want to be honest about that, because stories about this kind of thing tend to compress time in ways that make the waiting invisible. And the waiting was real and significant and harder in some ways than the discoveries themselves. There were filings and counter-filings. Brian Culver was a competent attorney who constructed a careful argument that the funds transferred to Cheryl had been gifts, not marital assets, and were not recoverable under state law. Sandra dismantled this argument with a thoroughness I found quietly satisfying to watch, using Martin's own documentation, the bank records, the transfer notes, the emails, to establish that the transfers were systematic, sustained, and concealed, which took them outside the legal definition of a gift and into territory that looked very much like fraudulent dissipation of marital assets. The phrase fraudulent dissipation is a legal term. It means exactly what it sounds like. There was a moment in the initial hearing, in a conference room rather than a courtroom, when Brian Culver made the argument that my husband had had the legal right to make financial decisions during the course of our marriage, and that I had not been excluded from accessing accounts. Sandra set down her pen, looked at him, and asked him to specify which accounts I had had access to, and how I was supposed to access accounts I hadn't known existed. The mediator, a retired judge named Charles Weston, wrote something on his notepad and didn't look up. Cheryl Contos did not attend that session. Her attorney attended. I had seen one photograph of her, found during my own research, A LinkedIn profile picture, professional, unremarkable. I had looked at it for a long time and then closed the browser and not searched again. I had no interest in understanding her. Whatever she had known or not known about Martin's life with me, she was not the person who had made me a promise in front of our family and kept a second life alongside it for 6 years. Martin was the person who had done that. This was the hardest thing to hold. The grief and the anger were not separate. They were the same substance, changing temperature. Some days what I felt for Martin was pure sorrow. The missing of him that had nothing to do with what I'd learned, the reflex to tell him something funny, and the catch in my chest when I remembered I couldn't. Other days I was so angry I had to leave whatever room I was in and stand outside in the cold for a few minutes until I was level again. Becca noticed once and asked me if I was okay. I said I was working through something. She said, with the particular directness of 17, "You don't have to protect me, Mom." "I know," I said. "I'm not protecting you." I'm still figuring out what to say. I told her on a Sunday in April. I sat her down at the kitchen table, the same table where I had opened Martin's note, where I had read his letter, where I had made coffee after things I didn't know how to process, and I told her as plainly and as carefully as I could. Martin had been in a relationship with another woman. He had been supporting her financially from our money. I had found out after his death and was working with an attorney to address it. I told her that her father had loved her. I believed that completely. I still do. Becca was quiet for a long time, not the focused quiet she used for problems she was solving, a different kind. "How long?" "6 years," I said. Another silence. Then she said, "Okay." And she got up and hugged me, which was not something she did often or easily, and I held on for longer than I probably should have. She didn't ask a lot of questions after that, not right away. She went to school. She came home. She started sitting with me in the evenings while I went through paperwork, not helping exactly, just being there, which was exactly what I needed and more than I had asked for. The settlement discussion happened in June, 7 months after Martin died. Sandra called me on a Tuesday morning and said Brian Culver had made a formal proposal. I asked her to describe it. The proposal offered a recovery of $95,000 from accounts and assets that could be clearly documented in exchange for a full release of any further claims against Cheryl Contos or her assets and a mutual non-disclosure agreement. I sat with that number for a moment. $95. Zero was not a small amount. It was also, by any reasonable accounting, less than half of what had been diverted. The proposal was designed to feel like resolution while functioning as a ceiling. I recognize the structure of it, the offer that looks like generosity and is actually containment. I told Sandra to decline. She said, without inflection, "All right." I had come to understand that was her version of approval. Brian Culver's response to the rejection came quickly and with a sharpness that had been absent from earlier communications. A follow-up letter, through Sandra, correctly, noted that pursuing further litigation would be costly, time-consuming, and emotionally taxing during an already difficult period. It noted that the evidentiary record had gaps that could be exploited on cross-examination. It noted that a public proceeding would necessarily involve details about Martin's personal life that might be painful for his family and damaging to his memory. The last point was the one that was designed to land. Martin memory, the threat of his reputation, dressed as concern for my feelings. I had been a physical therapist for 20 years. I understood the body's tendency to protect an injury by tensing the tissue around it, by building compensatory patterns that feel protective and are eventually damaging. I was not going to protect this injury. Sandra filed for formal discovery the following week. The deposition of Cheryl Contos happened on a Thursday in August in a conference room at Sandra's office. I was present, as was my right. Cheryl came with Brian Culver and a quietness that I hadn't expected. She was in her mid-40s, composed, dressed carefully in a way that I recognized as armor. Sandra asked her questions for 90 minutes. The process was methodical and not unkind, but it was complete. Sandra established the timeline of the relationship, the financial transfers, and Cheryl's knowledge of Martin's marital status. On that last point, Cheryl said she had understood it was complicated. Sandra asked her to define complicated. Cheryl said she'd understood he had a family. Sandra asked whether she had known he was actively diverting marital assets to support their arrangement. Cheryl's attorney objected. The question was noted for the record. I watched Cheryl Contos across a conference table in downtown Raleigh and felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger exactly. Not even the satisfaction I'd imagined. Something closer to exhaustion. The whole edifice of it, the 6 years of a parallel life, the careful accounting, Martin's letter on yellow legal pad paper, the running shoes by the back door, all of it finally visible. All of it spread across a conference table where a stranger's attorney was objecting to questions about things that had happened in the middle of my marriage. I drove home through the August heat with the windows down and thought about the oak tree in the backyard with the Christmas lights that were still on it in August because I hadn't been ready to take them down. Sandra called me on a Wednesday in September. The other side wanted to talk, she said. The revised proposal, delivered through proper channels this time, and without the edge that had accompanied the last communication, offered $147, zero in addition to the return of a documented account containing $38,000 that had not been disputed. Total recovery, $185,000. Plus a release of all claims and a mutual NDA. Sandra walked me through it. I asked her what she thought. She said, in the careful way she had of distinguishing between legal assessment and personal opinion, it's a reasonable number given what's recoverable, and the NDA is standard, but you're the one who has to live with whatever you decide. I sat with it for 2 days. The money was not nothing. It was close to what Martin himself had estimated in his letter. It wouldn't undo the 6 years or the deception or the particular grief of discovering that the person you built a life with had kept a significant portion of their life somewhere you couldn't see. But it was accurate. It reflected what had actually happened, in numbers, which was the only language this particular injury spoke. I told Sandra yes on a Friday afternoon, standing in my kitchen, looking out at the backyard. The agreement was signed in October. Cheryl Contos's attorney signed on her behalf. I signed in Sandra's office with a notary present, and then I drove to pick up Becca from her afternoon practice because she had started running track in the fall, which was new, and which she hadn't explained and which I hadn't asked about. I told my friend Anne, my sister, I told her the full shape of it over the phone, sitting on the back porch in the early October cold, and there was a long silence when I finished. And then she said, I always thought something was slightly off about his explanation for why we couldn't visit that Thanksgiving. I laughed. I hadn't laughed in a while, and it surprised me. Why didn't you say something? I asked, because I didn't know what I was sensing, she said, and because you seemed okay. I thought about that for a while after we hung up. How much of what we see in each other is what we're looking for versus what's there? How the surface of a life can hold an entirely different weight than the life beneath it. I started seeing a therapist in November, almost exactly a year after Martin died. Dr. Vivian Hayes in Cary, who worked with widows and divorce and trauma, and who had a small office with good light and a box of tissues on the table that she never drew attention to, but which was always there. I told her everything from the beginning, in order, and she listened with the particular quality of attention that professional listeners develop. Not performing interest, but actually present. After a few sessions, she said something that has stayed with me. She said, "You're not grieving one thing. You're grieving at least 3 things that got layered on top of each other, and your body hasn't been able to tell them apart." She was right. The grief for Martin as I'd known him, the grief for the marriage as I'd understood it, and something underneath both of those, quieter and more persistent, the grief for the certainty I'd had about my own perceptions, the sense that I had been living inside a life and hadn't fully seen it. That last one took the longest. Becca graduated in the spring. She'd been accepted to NC State, which pleased her and would keep her 45 minutes away, which pleased me more than I admitted. She was running track competitively by then, which turned out to be her way of processing the year, the speed of it, the precision, the way you can measure exactly how well you're doing by a number that doesn't lie. I sold the Cary house the following fall. I had decided over the winter, slowly and without drama, I wanted a house that was mine from the beginning, that didn't have Martin's desk in the upstairs office, or the echo of his guitar in the evenings, or the particular configuration of a kitchen where I'd had too many important conversations at the same table. I found a smaller house in North Raleigh, better garden space, a study with east-facing windows, close enough to Becca's campus that she could come for dinner without it feeling like an event. The filing cabinet I left with the Cary house. The new owners could have it. I took the oak tree lights down before the movers came. I have been, in the time since, building something that doesn't have a name yet. That's the honest answer. I work 4 days a week now. I see Dr. Hayes twice a month. I have expanded the garden at the new house beyond any reasonable scope for a single person, which I have decided is a form of optimism. Sandra Pratt sent me a card when the case was fully closed, not a form letter, a handwritten note, which told me something about the kind of person she was. I wrote back, "Some professional relationships earn a personal response." There is a particular question people ask when they know the shape of this story, or some version of it. They ask if I'm angry, and I tell them the truth. I was. I am sometimes still. Anger is appropriate when appropriate things happen. But anger as a permanent residence is too expensive. I couldn't afford the rent. What I carry now is something more like clarity. I know more about the life I lived than I did when I was living it, which is a strange and backward kind of knowledge. I know what the signs were that I explained away. I know that I was not stupid, that I was trusting, and that there is a difference. I know that a person can love you and still be capable of extraordinary carelessness with your life. I know also that I handled it, that when I found the note on Valentine's Day morning and sat on the floor of that office with a lockbox and 3 pages of yellow legal pad paper, I was not someone who had the resources or the knowledge or the emotional bandwidth that the situation required, and I found them anyway. I made the calls. I showed up to the depositions. I drove home from the coffee shop with Donna Albrecht's folder in the passenger seat and both hands on the wheel, and I kept going. Becca called me from campus last month and said, out of nowhere, that she had been thinking about what I'd done. She said, "I know it was the hardest year of your life. You never let me think there wasn't a way through it." I told her that was because there always was. Even when I couldn't see it, I believed that. She said, "Okay, Mom." And then she told me about the meet she had on Saturday and what her split times were, and I listened to her talk about running, precise and happy. And the kitchen where I stood had never belonged to Martin, and it was mine, and the light that came through the east window in the morning was exactly what I needed it to be. Some things you choose on purpose, some things just take root anyway. I was learning to tell the difference.